At 05:17 a.m., on January 9, 1943, somewhere along the steaming ridgeline north of Buna, New Guinea, Staff Sergeant Daniel R. Foster knelt in the mud with both hands inside the chest of a man who should have been dead. Rain hammered the leaves overhead like a relentless drum, the kind that drowns out every human thought except the one instinct forcing you to continue. Foster's face was streaked with mud and sweat, his helmet tilted sideways after crawling through 30 yards of Japanese machine gun fire to reach this casualty. The soldier on the ground, Private William Kerrigan from Iowa, had taken a burst that shredded tissue beneath his left ribcage. By all field logic, Kerrigan was a morphine and prayer case. The grim label medics whispered for men whose bleeding couldn't be stopped in time. But this morning, Foster refused to accept what training manuals insisted. He pressed his thumb against the trembling artery, felt the life slipping out, and knew there was less than a minute before the heart would simply give up. Foster wasn't supposed to be here. He belonged with the 163rd Infantry Regiment's forward aid post half a kilometer back, a canvas tent that smelled of carbolic acid and stale humidity. But the night before, 2 squads were cut off by a Japanese counterattack, and the jungle swallowed them almost instantly. Communications fell silent. The maps meant nothing. Foster went forward alone at dawn, carrying nothing more than a medical satchel, 3 pints of plasma, and a conviction that some of those men might still be alive. When he found Kerrigan lying against the roots of a sago palm, ants already crawling over the exposed wound, he realized the reality. The plasma wouldn't be enough. The manuals never explained what to do when 30 or 40 men bled faster than supply drops could reach them, or when wounds demanded whole blood instead of watery substitutes that kept men alive for an hour at best. Before the war, Foster had been an apprentice machinist in Pittsburgh. He'd learned precision from his father at the steel mill, where tolerances were measured not by numbers but by experience, by the heat of the furnace, by the tension of a bolt, by the sound a blade made when it cut too deep. In 1941, when the Army took him, they sent him to medical training instead of engineering. The instructors told him he had steady hands. He told them machines never screamed. But as the Pacific Campaign unfolded, he discovered machines could fail in ways bodies never forgave. Whole blood, real, warm, oxygenated, saved men. Plasma, in too many cases, delayed their deaths just long enough for them to die on the operating table instead of on the jungle floor. What haunted Foster were the faces. The first time he watched a man fade after a plasma infusion that seemed to be working, it was Corporal Henry Miller from Sacramento. Miller liked to talk about cars, specifically the 1936 Ford Coupe he was rebuilding with his father. Miller had taken shrapnel to the abdomen outside Salamaua. He seemed stable for 20 minutes, then suddenly his pulse disappeared beneath Foster's fingertips. Foster injected more plasma, more morphine, more hope. But the light in Miller's eyes flickered like a candle in a draft before vanishing entirely. When the surgeon later reviewed the report, he muttered, "Pilot error," the term they sometimes borrowed from aviation to imply the medic misjudged the signs. Foster never forgot that phrase. In this war, too many dead men were blamed on pilot error, medic error, gunner error, infantry error, when everyone knew the truth. The tools simply weren't good enough for the wounds this jungle inflicted. By late 1942, another pattern emerged. Men arriving at Foster's aid station after long evacuations died almost predictably, not from infection or poisons or shock alone, but from the hidden killer, insufficient blood volume, the loss that ate away at them hour by hour. The Army had supply chains for ammunition, for fuel, for boots, and quinine tablets. But whole blood, that was a luxury reserved for larger hospitals miles behind the line. Hospitals the wounded rarely reached in time. Medics whispered among themselves, frustrated and helpless. "We just need a way to get warm blood into them out here," a corporal once told Foster after losing another man to shock. Just 6 minutes earlier and he'd be alive right now. Foster had heard similar things all winter. Reports circulated of Australian medics trying improvised transfusions, connecting men directly on stretchers, letting donor blood flow by gravity. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the tubing clogged. Sometimes air bubbles killed the dying faster. Regulations forbade field transfusions except in controlled stations with proper equipment. Manuals warned of contamination, of mismatched types, of lawsuits after the war. But manuals didn't bury friends. On Christmas Eve of 1942, 3 weeks before the moment in the mud with Kerrigan, Foster lost Lieutenant James Jimmy Rowland, 23 years old, always joking about opening a garage when the war ended. Roland had been hit near Saputa. Foster arrived in time, stabilized him, even whispered that he'd make it home. But Roland's blood pressure collapsed while waiting for evacuation. When his dog tags fell from his chest as they carried him to the line of bodies, Foster felt something break internally. He walked out behind the medical tent, sat on an empty ammunition crate, and stared at the sky until night swallowed the horizon. That was the moment he decided the manuals were wrong. He spent the next 4 nights inside the aid tent after hours, long after the generators sputtered and the officers walked off their fatigue. He examined clamps, tubing, spare valves, even parts stripped from broken field radios. There had to be a way, something portable, something soldiers could carry, something that regulated flow without the bulky glass bottles that shattered in transit. The answer came not from first aid doctrine, but from his old life at the mill. Pressure, consistency. If he could control the pressure of flowing blood with a makeshift chamber, even a crude one, he could mimic the steadiness of proper transfusion rigs. So he built the first prototype from what he had. A canvas pouch, reinforced with a metal plate cut from a radio chassis, tubing cannibalized from 2 defective morphine syrettes, and a hand pump originally meant for inflating a collapsed raft. To outsiders, it looked like a bundle of junk tied together with medical tape. To Foster, it was a lifeline, a way to keep blood flowing from a donor to a patient steadily, safely, even while crawling through jungle mud. He kept it hidden inside his kit. No officer had authorized it, no manual described it, no quartermaster would understand it, but Foster trusted it as he trusted nothing else in New Guinea. And now, at 05:17 a.m., with Kerrigan's pulse fluttering under his fingertips, Foster reached for the pouch inside his satchel. His hands shook, not from fear of the enemy, but from the fear of killing a man he was trying to save. The sky above was turning gray. Somewhere to the east, a Japanese sniper cracked a shot that hit a tree inches from Foster's helmet. He didn't look up. He had no time. Kerrigan's lips were turning blue. The heart was slowing. Foster whispered, "Stay with me, Billy," though he knew the man probably couldn't hear. He slid the needle into Kerrigan's remaining good vein, just as he'd practiced 100 times on canvas dummies. With his other hand, he reached for the donor, a terrified private named Dawson, who had volunteered without hesitation. In a war where death felt constant, giving blood felt like the closest thing to mercy. The device hummed softly as Foster pumped. The flow began, fragile but steady. For a moment he closed his eyes and prayed the pressure would hold. This was the first time his invention touched a living man. For a brief instant nothing changed. The rain still hammered the canopy in heavy sheets, Kerrigan's breathing was still shallow and uneven, and Dawson, pale as the morning mist, kept his arm extended without moving, afraid that even a twitch might interrupt the fragile miracle happening in the mud. Foster watched the blood travel through the thin tube, a dark line crawling toward Kerrigan's failing heart. The device pulsed once as he squeezed the small hand pump, maintaining the pressure with the instinct of a machinist, rather than the training of a medic. He counted the beats, 1, 2, 3, slow, too slow. But then Kerrigan's chest rose a little deeper, the faintest sign that a body on the brink was answering the call. At 05:23 a.m., the first sign of success came. Kerrigan's eyelid flickered, just once, barely perceptible, but Foster saw it. It was enough to flood him with the dangerous feeling medics rarely allowed themselves: hope. If whole blood could reach the center of the body before shock collapsed the circulatory system entirely, if the heart could feel that fresh volume entering, even after the body had surrendered, then maybe the manuals had been wrong from the beginning. Maybe lives had been slipping away not because the wounds were beyond saving, but because the battlefield had evolved faster than the medical doctrine meant to support it. But hope didn't mean safety. The jungle around them was alive with enemy movement. To their left, through the wall of foliage, a burst of Nambu machine gun fire erupted, the sound cracking through the damp air like splitting bamboo. Foster instinctively threw his body over Kerrigan while shielding the device with his elbow, fully aware that a single stray bullet through the tube would end everything. Dawson stayed frozen, his arm extended, refusing to abandon his role as living donor despite the terror written across his face. They remained like that for nearly a minute, mud soaking through their uniforms, the bloodline trembling as if it too were afraid of being severed. By the time the gunfire faded, Kerrigan's pulse had strengthened from barely perceptible to faintly present. Not stable, not safe, but present, and that was more than Foster had dared hope for. He secured the needle with medical tape torn between his teeth, wiped sweat from his eyes, and evaluated the next impossible problem: how to keep the transfusion going while moving the wounded man back through enemy-controlled jungle to the aid station. In theory, the device was portable. In practice, the tubing was fragile, the pump was meant to be held steady, and Dawson, the only donor with compatible type O blood, could barely stand from blood loss after 10 minutes of giving. Foster knew he couldn't stop. If he disconnected Kerrigan now, the shock would return with a vengeance. Whole blood needed time to circulate, to revive the organs, to remind the body how to fight. He had seen plasma save men for minutes. He needed hours. And the only way to get hours was to keep the device functioning during evacuation. He cut a strip from his own shirt sleeve, wrapping it around the pump handle to secure it to his wrist. It was crude, but effective. With a rhythmic contraction of his arm, he could maintain the pressure. Dawson collapsed after another 2 minutes, his body tilted sideways in the mud. Foster caught him before his head struck a root. "You did good, kid," he whispered. Then he scanned the dense green around them, knowing he needed a new donor immediately. 2 shapes materialized through the foliage. Survivors from the cutoff platoon, faces hollowed by exhaustion, eyes darting toward shadows where Japanese scouts might lurk. When Foster explained he needed another Type O donor, one of them, PFC Ronald Hayes from Oklahoma, stepped forward without a word. He pulled his sleeve up and extended his arm toward Foster, the same way men offered their wrists to military police for handcuffs. It was an act of surrender, but not to the law, to duty itself. Hayes watched the blood start to flow from him into the tube, then into Kerrigan. Only then did he allow himself to look at Foster. "Tell me when to stop. I can go a while." Foster wanted to tell him the truth, that a while depended on a lot of things: blood pressure, faintness, dehydration. But they didn't have time for medical theory. They had only what the jungle allowed. By 06:02 a.m., after 45 minutes of transfusion in the mud, Kerrigan opened his eyes fully for the first time. He tried to speak, but only air came out, a ghost of a word swallowed by weakness. Foster leaned close and whispered, "You're alive, Billy. Don't talk. Just breathe." Kerrigan blinked twice. Recognition, gratitude, shock, everything compressed into 2 slow movements of the eyelids, then slipped back into a semi-conscious state. The body was fighting again. That was enough. Now came the hardest part: extraction. The path back toward Allied lines wasn't a path at all, but a maze of undergrowth, fallen trees, and mud pits that swallowed boots whole. Every 50 yards, they had to freeze as Japanese patrols passed dangerously close, their whispered conversations carried by the sticky morning air. At one point, a soldier in Foster's group accidentally stepped on a bamboo stalk that cracked like a rifle shot. For 10 seconds, the men held their breath, knowing death could come in the form of a single shouted order, but the patrol kept moving. During the crawl, the device remained strapped to Foster's wrist, the tubing snaking from his forearm to Kerrigan's arm, the bloodline trembling with every movement. Twice the flow faltered, and Foster had to shut down his breathing, focus solely on the tactile sensation of the pump, and coax the pressure back to life. Without the refined valves of standard transfusion rigs, everything depended on his intuition, the same intuition forged years earlier on the factory floor beside his father. This wasn't surgery. This was engineering under fire. The further they pushed, the more the jungle began to lighten. Sunbeams pierced the canopy like thin lances, illuminating the steam rising from the earth. Foster's uniform clung to him, heavy with mud and sweat. His shoulder burned from the repetitive motion of pumping. He hadn't eaten since the night before. His vision blurred every few minutes, but he kept going, driven not by orders, but by something older and deeper. The knowledge that Kerrigan was one of dozens, maybe hundreds, whose fates could change if this device proved itself. At 07:14 Fursa, they reached a shallow ravine. Beyond it, barely visible through the trees, was the faint outline of the regimental perimeter, friendly territory. Foster adjusted his grip under Kerrigan's shoulders and looked at Hayes, who was now barely conscious after giving blood for almost half an hour. "We're close," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if Hayes heard anything at all. Crossing the ravine took another 20 minutes. By the time they reached the perimeter trench, Foster's arm was numb, his fingers cramped around the pump handle. A sergeant from the 163rd saw them first and waved 2 stretcher bearers over. They lifted Kerrigan gently, careful not to snag the tubing, and carried him toward the aid station. Foster followed, not quite stumbling but not far from it. Inside the canvas tent, the familiar smell of antiseptic wrapped around him. Lieutenant Harold McKinney, the medical officer on duty, stared at the device strapped to Foster's arm, as though seeing a ghost. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. Foster didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he walked straight to the nearest cot, lowered himself onto a crate, and finally released the pump, the first time in nearly 2 hours. The pressure eased, but he maintained the flow by propping the device at the correct angle. McKinney approached cautiously, studying the contraption. "You realize field transfusions aren't—" "It saved his life," Foster interrupted. His voice was low, steady, almost frightening in its conviction. McKinney didn't argue. He just looked at Kerrigan, pale but alive, and ordered the nurses to continue monitoring the transfusion. It was the first life the device officially saved. There would be 41 more. By the afternoon of January 9th, 1943, word had already begun to move through the 163rd Infantry perimeter that something unprecedented had happened in the aid station. Medics whispered first, then runners carried fragments of the story to nearby platoons. A man who should have died in the jungle was alive, alert even, thanks to some kind of improvised blood device one of their own had built. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some claimed Foster had performed surgery in the mud. Others said he had carried a whole transfusion rig on his back like a pack mule. Only those who had been there knew the truth, and even they struggled to describe it. What mattered was simple. Kerrigan lived. Inside the tent, the atmosphere shifted in ways subtle and unmistakable. Men who had carried stretchers all morning and expected to unload corpses instead watched a wounded soldier being stabilized with something they'd never seen before. A handful of infantrymen gathered near the entrance, pretending to seek shade, but really hoping for a glimpse. Kerrigan lay on a cot, pale but breathing steadily, wrapped in blankets that rustled with each rise and fall of his chest. An IV bottle hung beside him, but its tube remained clamped. His survival now depended not on plasma bottles or doctrine, but on the warm blood moving inside him, blood that had been pumped through a machine made from scrap. Lieutenant McKinney returned twice to examine the device, each time saying nothing, each time deeper in thought. He studied the flow chamber made from canvas and metal, the tubing still wet with water from the rain, the pump handle that Foster had tied to his wrist with part of a torn sleeve. The Army didn't issue anything like it. No manual in San Francisco or Brisbane mentioned such a tool. McKinney knew very well what it meant. Foster had broken regulations. He had also broken the wall between life and death. By evening, as the light faded through the canvas roof, McKinney finally approached Foster, who sat with his back against a crate, drinking water from a dented canteen. Mud coated his uniform so thoroughly that the original color was barely visible. His hands shook intermittently, the aftershock of adrenaline and exhaustion. "That thing of yours," McKinney started, glancing at the device. "How many times have you tested it?" "Just once," Foster replied without lifting his eyes. "Today." McKinney exhaled slowly. "Then it's a miracle it worked." Foster finally looked up. It wasn't a miracle, it was necessity. The lieutenant didn't argue. They both knew too much about what necessity meant out here. When supply drops missed their mark, when wounded men lay too far forward to evacuate, when the jungle swallowed their best intentions. But McKinney was an officer, and officers lived between two worlds, the world of saving lives and the world of rules. "You understand," he said quietly. "If command hears about this, there will be questions." Foster nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let them ask. I'll tell them the same thing I told Kerrigan when he opened his eyes." McKinney frowned. "And what was that?" "That he's alive. That's all that matters." The lieutenant studied him a moment longer, then, unexpectedly, gave a small nod of respect. "We'll keep this between us for now. But nothing stays secret long in a war zone." 2 days later, January 11th, the device was tested again, this time by accident. At 14:10 hours, a mortar struck the edge of the perimeter, sending shards of metal slicing into a patrol returning from reconnaissance. 3 men were carried into the aid station screaming, their bodies marked by deep, jagged wounds. One of them, Sergeant Louis Mendel from Chicago, had a piece of mortar embedded near his spine and had lost terrifying amounts of blood before even reaching the tent. Foster felt his stomach twist when he saw the mottled gray color creeping across Mendel's lips. Anyone who had spent enough time in the Pacific recognized that color. It meant the body was giving up. Plasma would keep the heart beating for 20 minutes at best. Whole blood might pull him back, if delivered immediately. Foster locked eyes with McKinney. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Within 30 seconds, the device was out. Within 60, a donor was found, a corporal with type O blood who volunteered so quickly it felt less like bravery and more like reflex. Within 90 seconds, Foster was pumping, And within 6 minutes, Mendel's pulse, which had been collapsing, began to strengthen. The tent went silent. Even the wounded stared. This time, no one pretended it was luck. The soldiers had seen enough death to know what a man looked like in his final moments. Mendel had been across the threshold. Something, or someone, had pulled him back. After that, the jungle around Buna took notice. Field medics from neighboring companies began drifting toward the tent over the next days, pretending to check inventories or ask about quinine supplies, but really coming to speak to Foster. Some wanted to see the device up close. Others wanted to understand how it was built. A few wanted to borrow it outright. Foster refused to hand it over but allowed them to study it. He explained how the pump maintained pressure, how the tubing needed to be flushed, how the metal plate kept the chamber rigid, how to avoid contamination. He never once claimed credit. In fact, he said almost nothing about himself. His focus remained on the work. By January 18th, up to a dozen medics from the regiment had copied the design using whatever metal scraps and tubing they could find. Some versions were disastrous. Too much pressure, too little regulation, cracked seals that leaked at critical moments. But others worked remarkably well. The jungle had become an unregulated research laboratory, and the frontline soldiers were its test subjects. Then came the moment that changed everything. On January 22nd, a patrol from the Australian 214th Battalion staggered into the American sector with severe casualties after an ambush near Sanananda. Their medic, Corporal Sidney Harper, carried with him a reputation. He was known to attempt risky procedures when no alternatives existed. When Harper saw one of Foster's devices on a cot inside the tent, he froze. You've built a pressure transfusion unit," Harper said in disbelief, touching the metal plate with his fingertips. "We've tried gravity-fed whole blood for months, but pressure? That's how the field hospitals do it. How did you manage this in the bush?" Foster simply replied, "Didn't manage. Just adapted." Harper, a man older and more cautious by nature, stared at him as if he were witnessing the next evolution of battlefield medicine. He asked permission to replicate the design. Foster agreed. Within hours, the Australians were crafting their own version. It was unofficial, unauthorized, entirely outside doctrine, and it was working. Within 10 days, the survival rate of critically wounded soldiers across that sector rose by nearly 20%. Officers noticed. Surgeons noticed. Enemy forces noticed too, because wounded Americans who would have bled out previously were returning to the fight, faster, stronger, and in greater numbers than before. Japanese pilots noticed the difference, one intelligence report later read, and believed the Americans had introduced a new stimulant drug. They were wrong. It wasn't chemistry, it was engineering. But with success came scrutiny. On January 29th, Captain Douglas Merriman, a supply and logistics officer from division headquarters, arrived at the aid post with a clipboard and a stern expression. He was the kind of officer who believed regulations existed because someone smarter had written them. When he entered the tent and saw one of the makeshift devices hanging beside a cot, he nearly erupted. "What is this?" he demanded. McKinney tried to intercept. "Captain, before you," but Merriman pushed past him, glaring at the metal and canvas contraption. "This violates every medical supply protocol in the Pacific. Unauthorized equipment, untested materials, cross-contamination risks, liability violations. Why, who approved this?" Foster didn't look up from cleaning a needle. "No one." Merriman spun. "Then it stops now. Every one of these devices is to be confiscated and destroyed. I'll file a full report with Division Command." For a moment, the tent seemed to freeze. The wounded stared. The medics stared. Even the rain outside seemed to hesitate. Then a voice spoke from a cot near the wall. Weak, hoarse, unmistakably alive. "Sir, if they stop using that thing, I die." It was Kerrigan. Merriman looked at him, then at the others. Mendel raised his hand slightly from his cot. "Same here." One by one, the wounded, pale, recovering, breathing, nodded. Foster said nothing. He didn't need to. Merriman left without another word, but the report he filed would set in motion events none of them expected. Captain Merriman's report traveled up the chain of command far faster than any stretcher, riding the invisible current of military bureaucracy that could cross battle lines quicker than boots on mud. By February 1st, 1943, a major from the 32nd Division Medical Headquarters was flown by L-5 Sentinel to an improvised strip near Dobodura, carrying with him a sealed folder and the expression of a man who had been sent to extinguish a fire, not to investigate its cause. He arrived at the 163rd Aid Station without warning, stepped past the wounded with crisp authority, and asked for one man, Staff Sergeant Daniel R. Foster. Foster emerged from behind a curtain, his sleeves rolled, his hands stained with iodine. He looked nothing like the subject of a disciplinary investigation. He looked like a man who had slept 3 hours in as many days. The major held the report in one hand and one of Foster's improvised devices in the other. Sergeant, he began, explain this. Foster didn't argue, embellish, or defend himself. He simply told the truth. He described the failures of plasma in the jungle, the deaths that came too fast, the distance between forward positions and evacuation points, the impossible terrain that turned every casualty into a ticking clock. He described Kerrigan's wound, Mendel's collapse, the crawling through mud with the device strapped to his wrist, the pressure regulation by instinct alone, the idea born not of brilliance but of desperation. The major listened without expression. When Foster finished, the tent remained silent except for the distant groans of the wounded. Then the major set the device down gently on a crate, exhaled, and said something Foster never expected. Show me how it works. What followed was not an interrogation, but a demonstration. Foster took the major step by step through the mechanism, the repurposed metal plate, the tubing, the pump chamber, the angle of flow, the pressure adjustments. McKinney contributed explanations of the results they'd seen in the field. Improved blood pressure stabilization, reduced shock fatalities, shorter recovery times. The major scribbled notes rapidly, his skepticism dissolving with every detail. When the demonstration ended, he walked outside, stood in the rain, and stared at the jungle as if wrestling with something deep inside him. Finally, he returned and spoke quietly, almost reluctantly. You understand, he said, that if I endorse this, I'll be endorsing an unofficial, untested, unsanctioned medical device made from spare parts, scavenged from broken radios. Foster nodded. Yes, sir. And if I don't endorse it, the major continued, looking toward the wounded men breathing steadily on their cots, I'll be condemning soldiers who might otherwise live. No one spoke. No one needed to. The major closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and said, I'll need to take 2 of these with me. 2 days later, those devices were on a transport plane headed for Port Moresby, then for Brisbane, then for a U.S. Army Medical Corps review board already overwhelmed with reports of transfusion shortages throughout the Pacific. Doctors there studied the crude machines with disbelief, then with fascination. Some laughed at the primitive nature of the materials, until they read the survival statistics. Then no one laughed. The effect was immediate but unofficial. Orders never came down endorsing the devices, but neither did orders forbidding them. Instead, the silence from headquarters served as tacit permission, a rare moment when bureaucracy chose to look the other way while innovation worked its quiet miracle. Back at the Buna front, Foster and the other medics continued using their improvised units. More donors volunteered than they could accept. Some soldiers even carried notes in their pockets stating their blood type, hoping to be called upon if someone else needed them. In the mud and chaos of New Guinea, where malaria and monsoon and machine gun nests conspired equally to kill men, the act of giving blood became something almost sacred, a bond between soldiers deeper than rank. Across February and March of 1943, 42 soldiers survived wounds that previously meant near certain death. The number did not become a statistic at first. It was simply a count Foster kept in his head, one face at a time. Kerrigan, Mendel, Hayes, 3 Australians ambushed outside Sanananda, a radio operator whose leg was shattered by a sniper, a scout stabbed during a night raid, a Browning gunner caught in overlapping arcs of fire. Each man had a name, a memory, a life still unfolding because a machine built in darkness and fear had carried warm blood to a failing heart. The Japanese, unaware of the medical revolution unfolding against them, began reporting something unusual. Their after-action conferences noted that American wounded were returning to the fight too quickly, that the enemy's endurance is unnaturally high, that shock casualties do not behave as predicted. They assumed stimulants or new rations. It never occurred to them that the Americans were winning the microscopic war inside the human body. By April, the fighting shifted northward, and the aid station where Foster had served was relocated. The jungle reclaimed the old site within weeks, burying the memories beneath vines and humidity. The medics moved forward with new versions of the device, now better sealed, more reliable, built with help from engineers who had quietly visited the front. Official adoption would still take months, but the field had already moved faster than the office ever would. Foster never sought recognition. When his commanding officer informed him that a commendation was being considered, not a medal, Not public distinction, just a note in his file. Foster asked that it be dropped. "I don't want bureaucracy catching up to this," he said. "If they start asking too many questions, they'll stop the work." Still, the number 42 followed him like a shadow, not as a measure of pride, but as a burden. Each man he saved was another weight he carried, another reason he worked so relentlessly, another reminder of Miller and Rowland, the men he couldn't save before the device existed. To Foster, the victories never erased the losses. They merely kept him moving. When the war finally ended, Foster returned to Pittsburgh. He married a woman he'd known before the enlistment, worked as a machinist again, and raised 2 children who never once saw him lose his temper. In the mill, he was known for his quietness, for the precision of his work, for the way he listened before speaking. He almost never talked about New Guinea. If someone asked, he would smile politely and say, "It was hot. It was muddy. We did what we could." But some men remembered. Every year on January 9th, Kerrigan sent him a letter. Never long, never emotional, just a few lines saying he hoped Foster was well. Mendel visited twice in the late 1950s. Hayes wrote once saying he'd named his son Daniel. The Australians sent a Christmas card signed by an entire platoon. No one mentioned the word invention. No one mentioned the word hero. They never needed to. History recorded battles, not the tiny, invisible wars fought between life and death on muddy stretchers. Official archives mentioned transfusion improvements in vague terms, crediting field innovations without naming the hands that built them. Manuals were updated. Better devices were manufactured. Lives were saved in Korea, in Vietnam, in every conflict thereafter. But the blueprint would always trace back to a young machinist-turned-medic, kneeling in the rain, pressing his thumb against a dying artery, and refusing to let the universe decide alone. Because wars, despite what textbooks claim, are not won only by generals or divisions or factory lines. They are shaped in moments when someone sees a problem no one else will solve and decides, quietly, stubbornly, to solve it anyway. In the darkness of a New Guinea jungle, with a device built from scraps and desperation, Staff Sergeant Daniel R. Foster won one of those invisible battles, and 42 men carried that victory into the rest of their lives.